Thank you for being here again. And we listened to Ahmad this morning speaking for Christopher Melchert. Now he's speaking for himself. And we have the pleasure to be also with Rodrigo Adem, who's through Zoom with us. We can't see him now, but he's with us, he's hearing us. And we thank him strongly because it's now 6:30 in the morning in the United States, where he's now. So thank you for waking up so early. And it's up to you, Ahmad. Ahmad, we know you. You're co-organizer of this conference. You're teaching at AUC, and you will develop our topic through Hermeneutics, Quranic commentary. Thank you. It's to you.
Okay. Hello, everybody. I think if I was here in the last session, and the last session, if it was an example of taqleed, this session will be an example of ikhtilaf, because I'm going to respectfully disagree with one of my professors, also at Oxford. But not Christopher Melchert. So hopefully we can get the PowerPoint up in a moment. But let me say something about this presentation and its genesis and what brought me to present on the topic that I'm going to look at today. This is part of a book project I've been working on for rather longer than I'd like to admit. But like all good research projects, it actually began whilst I was teaching here a graduate seminar, I think about 4 or 5 years ago now, on Quranic interpretation, tafsir. I see some of the students here who had to suffer through those long seminars, sometimes over COVID, during COVID via Zoom. But for me, they were very, very formative for this project. And this is a project on a history of Quranic hermeneutics. So not really a history of specific tafsir works, but rather I'm interested in the question of what were the actual techniques? What were the actual techniques of Quranic interpretation? What does a Quranic hermeneutics actually look like? Rather than a hermeneutics that just tells us, well, in the early period we have something called tafsir bil-athar, and then we have tafsir bil-ra'i, and then we have Tabari, and then we have Zamakhshari. This is a history of stages and developments, but I'm more interested in the actual hermeneutics that were involved. Okay, thank you very much. So the actual hermeneutics. Now, the texts that I was reading and researching with my students were mainly books of exegesis, which can be described as the rhetoric-based tafsir. That is to say, the dominance of ilm al-balagha and ilm al-ma'ani on the writing of Quranic exegesis. Now, as a historical development, this is usually seen to be a mode of Quranic hermeneutics that begins with Zamakhshari. There are antecedents to this. So in histories of ilm al-balagha and ilm al-ma'ani, both in modern Arabophone scholarship and European and North American scholarship, this is of course found, the genesis of it is found in the works of al-Baqillani, in the works of al-Khattabi, Abu Sulaiman al-Khattabi, and then Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, and so on and so forth. And so in the modern historiography around Quranic hermeneutics, this mode of tafsir, which we can call rhetoric-based tafsir, this dominates the hermeneutical approach to the Quran that was transmitted in the colleges of the Islamic world, in the madaris. So we have very good information about the curricula that existed, whether it's in Timurid Iran, whether it's in Mughal India, whether it's in, what am I missing? Of course, Mamluk Madaris. This becomes the dominant mode of Quranic hermeneutics. This, as you might have guessed by now, if we're going to periodize this development, this is a post-classical development, right? We're really looking at the 12th century onwards, which we can describe, well, which historians often describe as post-classical. Now, it's post-classical. Of course, we're not interested in post-classical today. We're really interested in pre-classical. And so I've been writing this book, and then I had the good fortune to meet Adrian, and we spoke about the project, and we developed the call for papers, and it really helped me think about what I think is the missing piece of the puzzle in my project, which is this rhetoric-based tafsir that we find in the post-classical period. What kind of antecedents does it have in the early period of the Salaf? Okay. So in modern scholarship on this topic, whether it's in North American or European scholarship, or whether it's in modern Arabophone scholarship, there is a sharp divide in terms of the kind of exegesis, Quranic hermeneutics, that the Salaf did, and the kind of Quranic hermeneutics that happens in the post-classical period. Okay, so we have a number of works written recently in the modern period in Arabic, in which the argument is made very strongly that this mode of Quranic hermeneutics does not exist among the Salaf, and it's a much later development. Okay. Now, and so one way that this is often presented in modern scholarship is to speak of two modes of Quranic interpretation, ra'i-based and athar-based. Okay, this kind of division. And so my aim in this talk, and then, like I said, based on our discussions when I went back to my book project, is, the book now really begins with a chapter on the Quranic hermeneutics of the Salaf, which is what I want to present on today. A third introductory remark, the introduction has gone on for quite some time, I know, but the third introductory remark that I want to make is this question of the silence, the authority of silence. I've been thinking about this for some time, and especially during the morning session that we had. And I keep coming back to this idea that, does the silence exist? Okay, and why do we assume that there is a silence, even? And I want to use today as a case study a very brilliant work by a former professor and colleague of mine, Nikolai Sinai, who's a professor of Islamic studies at the University of Oxford. Incidentally, the first person with whom I read Al-Hujweri's Kashf al-Mahjub in 2010, he's written a brilliant book recently. It's called A Concise Historical Dictionary of the Quran, or the Key Terms of the Quran, something like that. You can look it up, published by Princeton University Press. And one of the things, I'm going to get into this in more detail later, but one of the things that you find in Nikolai Sinai's book is that there is a total, there is an almost total dismissal of the Quranic hermeneutics of the Salaf, of the first three periods, generations. And so I want to get into that a little bit. I think it goes to the very heart of this question of silence. Is there a silence, or is it that modern historiography has really failed to use a very famous academic idiom, if modern historiography has not allowed the Salaf to speak? Okay, so this is something I want to get into today. So the talk is going to really be split into three parts, looking at this question of what I call the death of Quranic hermeneutics, a rhetorical flourish based on, of course, another, the idea of the death of the author. I'm going to argue that we can identify a Quranic hermeneutics of the Salaf that contains real continuities with the post-classical tradition of Quranic hermeneutics. And finally, I'm going to come to this question of why does this idea of silence dominate in our current treatments of this period of early Islam? And for that, I'm going to end with Spinoza. So, definitions. Who are the Salaf? This is a hadith that is found in three separate places in Sahih al-Bukhari. There are many other shawahid, many other scriptural references for the idea of the Salaf, but I'm just going to mention this one so I can get to the heart of what I really want to talk about. And I just want to draw attention to, of course, this is the subject of a lot of hadith commentary, but I just want to draw attention to a few comments that Ibn Hajar in his commentary makes about the Salaf, so that we kind of know who and when we're dealing with. So Ibn Hajar has a discussion about qarn, and what kind of period does this actually indicate? There's a difference of opinion. Is it 70 years? Is it 80 years? Is it 100 years? Is it 120 years? And of course, this is very, very important to actually figure out. You've got to get the periodization right, because then it depends who you admit and who you exclude into that period, number one. So he eventually settles on this idea that the mashhur, the most authoritative opinion, we could call it, is the idea of 100 to 120 years. Okay? And so he says that, he also, interestingly, he gives us a cutoff date for the Salaf, which is the year 220 Hijri. This for him is a cutoff date for the period of the Salaf. So he says that before this period, we have the companions, we have the successors, and we have the successors of the successors, which in English we tend to call followers, just, because the other phrasing is a little bit clumsy in English. He says, after the year 220 Hijri, let's see, وفي هذا الوقت ظهر البدع ظهورا فاشيا وأطلقت المعتزلة ألسنتها ورفعت الفلاسفة رؤوسها وامتحن أهل العلم ليقولوا بخلق القرآن وتغيرت الأحوال تغيرا شديدا. So after the year 220, heresies appear, the Mu'tazila gain prominence, philosophical movements emerge, the mihna occurs, which is the great interrogation or the great trial against the notion of an uncreated Quran. And then he says massive changes take place. Okay? So this just helps us to kind of periodize, so we know exactly what kind of definitions we're working with for who the Salaf actually are. Okay. What do I mean by the death of hermeneutics? I'm going to come back to this point a little later, but this is a quote from Nikolai Sinai's book. I don't know if I'm standing in the way of anyone. Am I? So this is in the introduction to his book, The Key Terms of the Quran. This book has no ambition to undertake a longitudinal study of the rich and absorbing post-Quranic reception history of the words discussed. This has not, however, prevented me from making limited use of pre-modern Islamic scholarship. Where this seemed helpful in elucidating a range of meanings that Quranic terms would have conveyed to the Quran's initial addressees. So this is very interesting in the sense that Professor Sinai is trying to, the aim of the key terms of the Quran is to really document the meanings of the Quran as they would have been received and understood by the Quran's first addressees. Okay? But in order to do that, there's a methodological insistence on a break with the communities that succeeded directly the addressees of the Quran. So this is, I would say it's a typical British understatement. It's a methodological conundrum, right? There's a lot of issues here. There's an interesting caveat where this seemed helpful in elucidating. This is something we're going to come back to. This kind of selective use of Quranic hermeneutics, when it tends to elucidate a certain meaning, just keep that in mind. It's something we're going to come back to. And then I like this. One thing about Professor Sinai, which, intellectually very, very honest, of course, he says, in fact, it is very likely that the pre-modern scholarly tradition would have had much more to offer than the present book is able to convey, if only I had permitted myself to spend more time looking. So today we're going to spend some more time looking into this. Another point I want to make about the key terms, just to give you an example of what I mean by the death of Quranic hermeneutics. Sounds very dramatic. In some places, in fact, in the majority of places, Professor Sinai argues for what he calls the plain and obvious meaning. Okay? So for example, if we go to one of our first slides, he has an entry on the word Allah. Okay? How could he not? And he says the Allah of the Quran is visible, spatially located, an embodied being, a humanoid, and not merely a body, but also, at least in some sense, an anthropomorphic body. This is the conclusion. This is the conclusion if we follow the plain meaning of the Quran. What he later says, maybe he says it here, at face value. Okay, and all emphases are mine in italics. So he says, the obvious reading of the material just surveyed, and he's talking about verses of the Quran that's referred to the hand of God or the face of God. Okay? The obvious reading of the material just surveyed is that the Quran considers God to be at least in principle visible and to be spatially located. The Quran is devoid of similarly explicit caveats about understanding its language according to its plain meaning. So he's saying that there is no reason why we should assume that the Quran doesn't want to be taken at face value. Okay? There is accordingly far more reason to take the Quranic statements presented earlier at face value. I mean, that is the hermeneutic that we have here. The hermeneutic is we take the plain meaning and we take Quranic statements at face value. And he concludes, the Quranic portrayal of God is indeed that of an embodied being. Now, I'm not interested in this presentation and in the book, I'm not interested in the debate about, whether the God of the Quran is an embodied being or not. That's a theological discussion. I'm not interested in that. I am very interested in the hermeneutic. And what happens if one adopts a hermeneutic like this, but also kind of insists on silencing this earlier tradition of Quranic hermeneutics. Okay, so here it's not really a willful silence of the Salaf. It's actually a silence that is imposed onto the Islamic tradition. Now, if only that were it. Because in another passage, of course, as all of you know, there are verses of the Quran which are difficult to construe at face value. And so, in the same work, a few pages after, we find Nikolai Sinai arguing against plain meaning. Why? Because 6103, I'm trying to remember. Is this La tudrikul absar wa huwa yudrikul absar? I forget now, but maybe someone could just remind me. It's in my notes somewhere. And so, in this case, this is a verse of the Quran which goes against the idea of God as, that's the one, yes? Yeah. So the eyes cannot perceive him, but he perceives everything. So this, of course, goes against this idea of God being an embodied meaning. So what is Professor Nikolai's solution here? His solution here is to argue against plain meaning, number one, but also to argue and to borrow from the Sunni Quranic hermeneutical tradition. And this is the kind of methodological conundrum that I was referring to, okay? That if we're going to argue, as Nikolai Sinai does, that the Quran has to be taken at face value and that there should be no attention paid to the Quranic hermeneutics of the tradition. But when you're confronted with a verse that, if we take at face value, poses problems for our larger interpretation, then it's okay to cull from the pre-modern Sunni Quranic hermeneutical tradition. Okay. In other words, we have a problem in terms of methodological consistency. So, can the Salaf speak, or even can the Salaf think? So we have actually a decent corpus of Quranic hermeneutics from the period of the Salaf. This is just, I've taken a bit of liberty. I've added Al-Jinni here, but let's just put him to the side because he's really outside of Ibn Hajar's periodization. But this is a small selection. And in the book, I treat the first chapter treats a number of early works of the Quranic hermeneutics of the Salaf. So, there is a Quranic hermeneutics of the Salaf. It has actually survived. It's not simply buried in the exegesis of Al-Tabari or Al-Wahidi. It exists as a textual corpus and a textual tradition. And so I've decided for this presentation and for the book not to rely on Al-Tabari and not to rely on Al-Wahidi, because we're always dealing with the problem of, are these people actually quoting early authorities or not? Can we trust them or not? And so to bypass that entire methodological problem, it's just easier to go back to these works which exist and have been published. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to present a few important key words in Quranic hermeneutics. And these key words are absolutely central to the rhetoric-based tafsir of the post-classical period that I mentioned right at the beginning. And so what I've decided to do is to actually, do we find any of these terms that become so dominant for the rhetoric-based tafsir of the post-classical period? Do we find it in the early period or not? And if we do find it in the early period, then we can argue for certain continuities in the hermeneutical community of Quran interpretation. So one of those key terms is this idea of taqdeem and ta'khir, which is, in plain usage, plain meaning, means to bring something forward or to delay. And so again, this is a key topic. So if you open, let's say, I get his name, Badr ad-Din. Burhan is the book, so it's not. Badr ad-Din az-Zarkashi in his Burhan, which is one of the key manuals of Quranic interpretation, especially the rhetoric-based interpretation, he'll have a section on taqdeem and ta'khir. Abdul Qahir al-Jurjani, Zamakhshari, the other rhetoricians, they also, this is a key rhetorical device and technique. So here we find Muslim ibn Khalid az-Zanji. This is a scholar from Basra. He was actually a hadith scholar, but he leaves behind a fragment of his work of tafsir. And indeed, we find him referring explicitly to this hermeneutical technique of taqdeem and ta'khir. What is the taqdeem and ta'khir here? The verse of the Quran, أنزل على عبده الكتاب. So normally it would have read, what one would expect is أنزل الكتاب على عبده. Okay? But why the taqdeem of abdihi, the jar? Why the taqdeem? Because if it were to read أنزل الكتاب على عبده ولم يجعل له عوج, there would be a problem in meaning, because the iwaj, the crookedness, could refer to his servant, abdihi. And so this is not the intent, the Quranic intent, and so this is how the scholars of tafsir and the rhetoricians explain taqdeem and ta'khir. So what we can clearly see is, I'm pretending I can't see so I can take more time. So this is taqdeem and ta'khir, okay? That example is clear, okay? Very clear usage of the term. I should say, there are many, many more examples of this in which the early Salaf do not use the phrase taqdeem and ta'khir, but it's indicated. But I want to stick for the presentation, I want to show you the terms themselves so that it can't really be disputed. Another important discussion we have, and this is in Al-Akhfash Al-Awsat. So there's Akhfash Al-Akbar, but this is Al-Awsat. His Ma'ani Al-Quran, in which we have this wonderful discussion, which I wish we could spend more time on idmar. Idmar is a difficult word to translate. I've called it for now omission, because it's a sister of hadf, which we call ellipsis. Okay? And here there's a discussion of the verse in the Quran, and there's a discussion whether the fa and the lam, have they been omitted because it's so obvious that it need not be included here. Of course, this goes back to the idea of ijaz, the brevity of the Quran. The Quran seeks brevity as one of its rhetorical devices. So there's this discussion about the fa and the lam, and then there's also shawahid that are adduced from the works of poetry. And so here, the notion of idmar and the mudmar, which is, again, an absolutely fundamental subject in ilm al-balagha, ilm al-ma'ani, but it's also at the heart of post-classical Quranic hermeneutics. We find the actual terms and discussions, and in fact here they're being debated. So we can see that there is a debate going on in this period. Okay. In the same discussion, as we move on, we see that there is also a discussion here of hadf, which is usually translated as ellipsis. Again, a key point in balagha. Why are we mentioning all these terms? Just to remind us. Because these early hermeneutes of the Quran among the Salaf are arguing that it's not enough to take the Quran at face value. And the whole discussion about idmar and hadf is about discovering what is so obvious that it has been omitted in the Quran. Okay? This goes back to this idea of i'jaz. Okay? So, according to the early Salaf, this idea, there is an active process and hermeneutic that is really challenging this idea that Professor Sinai adopts in his book, The Key Terms. Okay. This is Yahya ibn Salam. This is an interesting example that I wanted to cite because this is a verse that Professor Nikolai uses in his book, Mimma Amilat Aydina, to say that, well, this is referring to God's very hand, his very handiwork, and so we are dealing here with an embodied humanoid being. However, in the very early period, Yahya ibn Salam, again among the Salaf, it is glossed here not at its face value, right? It's talking min fi'lihi, meaning his act, or his action, or his act of creation. Okay. We also find here uses of another very key idea in balagha. I need to wrap up very soon, but here we have a verse in the Quran that refers to shahawat. Okay, shahawat, which normally would be translated as desires. But here the idea is that this actually is a reference, a direct reference, according to exegetes, to zina, okay, to fornication, okay. So this idea that you cannot take shahwat at its plain meaning, all right. We have other examples. آتَيْنَاهُمْ مُلْكًا عَظِيمًا. Here, this verse becomes there's an important discussion around the tankir, the indefiniteness here. In works of balagha, tankir, the use of the indefinite is a way to tafkhim, to refer to something to be noble and esteemed. Okay, so the idea here is that mulk here refers to nabuwa, prophethood. Okay, and this is something we find with other terms in the Quran, such as rahma. Rahma in the Quran is glossed by early Salaf hermeneutes, not to mean mercy, but to mean prophethood. Okay. And now, in these cases, we don't have technical terms that are used. I want to just bring that to your attention. No technical terms are used, but here in Sufyan al-Thawri, his tafsir, we do have right at the end here this word which we find in the Quran, rafath. Okay? He says here, not just rafath, but a number of other terms. He says, وَلَكِنَّ اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلْ كَنَّا. Okay? That these terms are all kinayas to indicate sexual intercourse. Okay? So here we actually have Sufyan al-Thawri using the term. Okay. Now I'm going to come to a conclusion. From Salaf to Khalaf. Okay? Zarkashi, who I mentioned, who dies in 794, he explains that according to him, the hermeneutical authority of the Salaf does not stem from a blanket of silence. Rather, it's from a lack of complete and total retrieval. He says, the explanation and interpretation of the Quran has not reached us from the companions in its totality. Okay, so there is not silence, but there is a problem of retrieval. Okay? He also goes on to argue that he says, he's referring to the post-classical scholars, we are deficient in our ability to understand and apprehend the rules of language. Unlike the early Salaf, we must toil long and hard to learn these rules and implications of meaning. We, the post-classical scholars, are therefore more in need than any other people of the hermeneutic of the Quran. And so in the idiom of this conference, Az-Zarkashi sees the problem of the Salaf not to be of one of authority from silence, but rather the problem of retrieval. So, what is the future of Quranic hermeneutics in terms of modern scholarship? For Professor Sinai and for a number of modern scholars, the study of the Quran is really, in the academy, is really driven by what Professor Nicolai in another book calls the Spinozan hermeneutic. And he says, historical criticism undercuts the potentially disastrous use of such proof texts as ammunition in religious and political conflicts. I mean, that's also a very, there's a lot of political undertones to that. We don't have time to get into that. But what are the consequences of Spinozian hermeneutics? This distinction between the truth of Scripture and the meaning of Scripture, this Spinozian hermeneutics really ends up insisting on the silence of the Salaf as a hermeneutical community, but also of post-classical Quranic hermeneutics. So that's something that we should be aware of. Okay? Also, this Spinozian hermeneutics requires the dismissal of the hermeneutical community, and it means that the Salaf as a body of thinkers and hermeneutics can be ignored. And I've tried to argue in this paper that it's possible actually to identify a very clear articulation of Quranic hermeneutics in the Salaf, if only we step outside of the Spinozian paradigm for Quranic hermeneutics. Thank you.